The Last Lighthouse. Elias kept a notebook with circles for each rotation of the lamp and small margins for the things that worried him before he slept. The lighthouse sat on its cliff like a slow, white sentinel, and the ocean learned to move politely around its base. Most nights he watched the beam mark the rocks and return like a tide, thinking of old maps and ships that did not know how to be quiet. In the lantern room there was a window that fogged with his breath and a brass rail warmed by generations of hands. He would stand there until the light rolled over the horizon and the world turned small and obedient. It was a lonely kind of tenderness to count the minutes between flashes, but loneliness is a book with many chapters, and Elias had learned their names. One autumn wind brought him a scrap of paper pressed between the panes, a map folded to a near-invisible crease and traced with a child's careful hand. The map led, impossibly, back to the house he had once left to see better places. He followed the lines like a promise and found, under the floorboards of the storeroom, a shoebox of letters tied with a ribbon the color of fog. They were polite and ridiculous in their wish to be remembered. He read until the lighthouse shifted its beam and the sea exhaled. When he wound the brass lamp and shut the room's door, the letters lay like a small harbor in his lap, and the light kept turning with the gentle certainty of a machine dreaming of home. Sleep came then, soft and patient. Whispering hallway. When the lights in the old flat hummed low, Mara learned to time her breaths to the building's slow, patient rhythms. The hallway beyond her door never sounded like a hallway. It sounded like someone speaking softly into a pocket, rearranging small memories into tidy stacks. At night the plaster sighed and a voice threaded through the vents, not loud enough to startle, but clear enough to be company. Sometimes the voice counted, sometimes it named the colors of things she had already forgotten. Mara would stand barefooted on the rug and press her palm against the cool wood of the banister and tell herself those sounds were only pipes and the wind, and that was how she let herself fall toward sleep. Once, she learned, if you listened with your whole chest, the voice would tell you a single small, true detail about the person who had lived in the apartment before you, the way they liked their tea, the name of a lost cat, the nursery rhyme they hummed when alone. Those details felt like warm breadcrumbs. She followed them like a child following lights toward a distant kitchen. One night the hall said her name in a tone that remembered rain. The syllables curled like steam. Mara smiled because the sound felt almost like a hand and because it promised to wait while she finished worrying. She lay back on her pillow, counted the hush the voice left between each word. Sleep came then, soft and patient. Soft snow, silent house. Snow fell slow and patient over the town, and the house on the lane wore its white like an old shawl. Inside, the oven kept an even, sleepy heat, and Mr. Hovell moved with the sure-footed gentleness of a man who had learned the weight of his own years. He set a kettle on, folded a newspaper, and would sometimes, without thinking, put a second cup across from his own and stir as if another presence sat opposite him politely. The second cup never needed to be sipped. Its steam hung like memory above a place already warm with habit. The house seemed to clear its throat before sleep, and the walls collected the day's small sounds into a softer language. In the evening, a radio that had once sung news broadcasts now favored old lullabies, and the tiny creak of the stairs read like a line in a bedtime story. Outside, the snow slowed the world's steps until everyone passed like a slow, distant animal. Once, on a night that tasted of wood smoke and tinned oranges, there came a soft knock on the parlor door. Mr. Hovell answered expecting a neighbor, and found only a folded scarf laid over the threshold and a note in a careful, old hand that read, "I remember your jokes." He smiled. Grief is a companion that sometimes leaves gifts. He brought the scarf inside, warmed it by the stove, and set it on the chair opposite his own. The house hummed its low, comforting tune, and the snow drew a blanket over the world. He let his eyes close to the rhythm of a remembered laughter slipping through the rooms, and sleep rose like steam and held him as if to cradle a child. Sleep came then, soft and patient. The quiet doll. The porcelain doll sat by the window with its hands folded, a small, patient thing stitched into the quiet of the house. Its dress smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and its hair had been braided so many times the strands gleamed with the memory of fingers. Children in the street knew not to knock on that window at night, because when the street lamps went down the doll sometimes turned its gaze the smallest degree and hummed a tune with no words. The tune was not cruel, it was sedate and slightly sad, like someone tucking a blanket around a sleeping person and lingering for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Every so often the family would find the doll in a new spot with a thin, polite note pinned to its shoulder. I watched, I waited. There was a rhythm to these visits as steady as a clock. The family learned to wind the dolls softly and to leave an extra slice of cake on the sill when the house felt particularly thin. On a winter evening when the rain had the taste of metal, Lucy wound the key herself and pressed the mechanism close to her ear. The music started with the softness of a lullaby, and then, as the needle ticked, the house felt full of small evidence that the doll had been somewhere else on its rounds: a smudge on the curtain, a single petal on the stair, the faintest impression of a footprint on the carpet. Lucy smiled because the sounds made sleep easier, because the doll kept to its rituals, and because even when you know something watches, it can still sing you to sleep. Sleep came then, soft and patient. Midnight bus route. The midnight bus came on nights when the town's clocks had learned to nod off early and the gutters breathed out in the dark. It did not belong to the daytime routes. It rolled from the edges of maps and smelled of old leather and paper. People who stepped aboard never looked exactly the same when they stepped off. Jonas found it one night because he missed 3 trains, and the sky had the kind of patience that let small wrongs slide into something else. The driver wore a coat like a folded story and moved with the slow, precise care of someone who had memorized every stop. The passengers were quiet, each cocooned in their own thought, and the lights over the seats glowed with a steady amber hush. The bus smelled of oranges and library pages. It drove along streets that curved into lanes Jonas had not known existed and past houses that held other people's dreams like windows. When the bus stopped for him, the driver handed him a lopsided ticket with the name of a place he had been trying to forget. Jonas kept the ticket in his pocket like a small, obedient stone. At the end of the route, the passengers stepped into a dawn that had the polite stiffness of a new sheet. Each of them moved a little lighter, as if some small worry had been folded and tucked into the upholstery for safekeeping. Jonas felt it too, something unburdening itself like a patient hand. He walked home in the hush before breakfast, and sleep on his pillow felt, for the first time in a long while, like the inside of a warm, secret room. Sleep came then, soft and patient. Window at the end. From his bed Julian watched the neighbor's window throw a slow rectangle of light across the ceiling as if someone were sketching routes on the dark. Sometimes the rectangle grew narrow and then wide, as if breath had directions. In that light there moved a silhouette who performed quiet tasks with calm, repetitive hands, folding a scarf, lighting a candle, setting a bowl just so. The silhouette never spoke. Julian told himself stories about that shape: an artist who worked late, a seamstress mending the world's small tears, a person who had learned the pleasure of ritual. The shape was a kind of lullaby, each movement a metronome that steadied the nights. When Julian felt restless, he counted the small, private motions and let each repetition carry him inch by inch toward sleep. Once the silhouette paused and raised a hand in a wave that did not need replying. Julian, who had never met the neighbor, lifted his own hand reflexively at the ceiling and felt suddenly like someone participating in a secret custom. The wave left a quiet warmth in the room and a line of comfort that braided his breath into something slower. Days later, a parcel arrived for Julian from an unknown sender, a small knitted scarf in the exact color of the silhouette's candlelight. He wrapped it around his neck that evening and lay down. The neighbor's window kept its ritual, the silhouette moved without hurry, and Julian slept through a gentle procession of dreams that felt like stepping carefully through a house full of soft, considerate people. Sleep came then, soft and patient. The Archivist's Lullaby. Mara worked among files that smelled of glue and patient ink and learned the careful art of folding histories into neat, retrievable places. Her hand could find a name in 1,000 pages like someone finding a familiar chord. The archive's lights were warm and reliable, and the building kept its own measured breath between the stacks. People came asking for documents and left with neat envelopes. Sometimes they appeared relieved to see their past reduced to neat sentences. Mara liked the way the files settled on the desk like small boats. There was, tucked behind a row of unremarkable borough maps, a thin notebook that had no catalog number. Its leather was soft as sleep, and it was filled with lists of ordinary things: a pair of gloves, an old photograph, a child's complaint about the cold. When she read it, she recognized the handwriting as the slow trace of someone who had catalogued kindnesses instead of crimes. The margins were full of tiny, affectionate notes: left at door, smelled of tea, forgot to close window. Mara closed the book and, that night, left the desk with a resolve to be a little kinder in the way she stacked her own things. She began to tuck small favors into envelopes and slide them between files: a stamped postcard, a candy wrapper, a pressed leaf. The building received them with the absence of astonishment of a place that had always known people were messy and gentle. Her lullaby was the scratch of a pen and the slow returning of a folder to its place, and it was enough to cradle the office into an evening so soft that the archives themselves sounded like someone breathing in their sleep. Sleep came then, soft and patient. Room number 9. Room number 9 had a window that looked over an ivy-wrapped courtyard and a bed that remembered the shape of many travelers. People said that 9 made you dream in the same slow river, and that you woke with the sense of having been rowed somewhere safe. Lila arrived with a suitcase that smelled faintly of citrus and the polite fatigue of a person trying to leave herself behind for a night. The innkeeper was a small, steady man who moved like someone who had learned hospitality as a craft. He showed her to 9 and told her it would do as it liked, that rooms are picky and often choose who sleeps in them. Lila laughed and unpacked, and the room accepted her with the quiet, confidential air of an old friend offering a cup of tea. At dusk the courtyard began to keep its own soft time. A cricket tuned itself to the stepping of the guests' breathing, and the ivy leaned in like a curtain. Lila lay down and found the bed warm as if a previous occupant had only just left. In the morning she woke with the memory of a river and a boat without oars, and the feeling that something gentle had followed her through the night and laid a hand on her shoulder while she slept. She left a note for the innkeeper saying simply, "Thank you," and found, folded under her pillow, a pressed sprig of ivy and a postcards with no message. The world feels kinder when small mysteries are returned like lost gloves, and Lila carried the quiet of 9 with her like a secret shawl that fit perfectly as she walked away. Sleep came then, soft and patient. Under the orchard. The orchard spread its rows like a set of patient, listening people, and the trees carried fruit that tasted of memory. Each apple held a flavor that bent toward a small regret or a soft apology, and the ground was thick with the soft, polite squeak of leaves rubbing together in the evening. Tomas walked between the trunks because the path there felt like an old language he could almost speak, and because fruit made gentleness tangible. Farmhands had planted the orchard with the belief that fruit could be taught to remember. They placed stones for boundaries and whispered names into the soil as if it were a long, quiet prayer. Tomas learned which trees yielded consolation and which offered the sharpness of a truth you had once avoided. When he picked one it fit his palm as if expecting to be cradled, and when he bit into it the taste unrolled a short, tidy memory, a small kindness he had given, a slight he had not meant, a letter he had never sent. In twilight the orchard kept its own soft music, branches sighed against one another and the crickets set a tempo. On a night when Tomas felt particularly heavy, he found a bench beneath the oldest tree and laid his head on his knees. A breeze came down the aisle and coughed up a single, perfect apple that thudded into the grass like a gentle knock. He ate it slowly and felt a small, precise easing, like someone unbuttoning a collar. He slept there among the roots and woke at dawn with his pockets full of seeds and the sudden quiet confidence that some things, once tasted and acknowledged, choose to be gentler. Sleep came then, soft and patient. The slow return. He had been gone so long the house had developed habits that did not include him. Curtains had been drawn by people who were practicing polite forgetfulness and the kettle kept a small list of times to hiss without interruption. When Jonah came back the path to his door was a familiar sentence and the lock turned with the slow constancy of a story resuming. Inside, the furniture had settled into arrangements that made sense without him and the photographs had gathered a neat, sympathetic tilt. He moved through the rooms like someone reading a letter he had once written and left open. The house watched with gentle patience, and each floorboard greeted his weight like an old friend who knew how to nod. In the study he found a single, folded page on the desk with his name on it in a hand he did not immediately recognize. The page contained a short list of small truths. You left coffee on the stove once. You always mended the left cuff. You sang out of tune in the kitchen, but it was your music. Jonah laughed quietly because the list made him into a person who could be forgiven. He set the page into a book and lit the lamp and the house sighed like a long, relieved exhale. That night, he slept as if someone had smoothed the covers and tucked a note in the pocket of his pillow, "Welcome back." The note did not try to explain the absence, it simply acknowledged arrival. Jonah fell into sleep the way a tide returns, and in the house that remembered him the dark was warm and disciplined and full of small, unassuming consolations. Sleep came then, soft and patient. The hollow house. When Mara first saw the hollow house it wore darkness like a garment, heavy, tailored, and somehow alive. The windows were hollowed eyes, the porch a jaw that sighed with every wind. She rented it because the landlord said the price was generous, and because the creak of floors promised stories that needed hearing. The first night the house learned her name by the smell she left in the kitchen, coffee, wet wool, and it kept whispering it under the breath of the radiators. Doors closed themselves with the politeness of old friends and then opened again with the hunger of strangers. At midnight the portraits on the landing shifted position by a finger's margin and arranged their gazes into a single, long look that remembered someone else's wrongs. Mara found messages carved beneath the floorboards, dates and initials and single urgent verbs: wait, remember, stay. She argued with the house, aloud and clumsy, like a person bargaining with fog, and sometimes it answered in the language of small, precise disasters: a glass dropped on the tile, a mirror clouding with breath that was not hers, the slow, measured drip from a ceiling she could not find. Neighbors said the house had a history of hospitality that lasted exactly one season. Tenants left with pockets full of ash and a polite, stunned smile. Mara stayed because the house made grief feel less solitary. It offered memories back at odd hours like someone handing you a warm coat after a snowfall. One dawn, when the sun slid a blade of light along the stairs, she climbed and found the top room empty except for a single chair and a note on the seat: "You remembered me." She sat, and the house folded its walls around her like hands. Outside, The keening of morning was ordinary. Inside, the house began to speak in a quieter, hungrier language, and Mara understood that hospitality and hunger could be cousins. The door shut softly behind her, and the hollow house kept its patient watch. The portraits remember. The Bannister house had a gallery of faces that never seemed to tire of watching. They were oil and varnish, and the kind of frown that learned to persist when a household practiced long silences. Visiting the house on an inheritance inspection, Tomas felt the frame's collective breath like a pressure behind his ears. The oldest portrait hung above the fireplace and possessed a softness in its smile that did not belong to paint. At night, the lamplight seemed to find new depth in the eyes, glossy pupils that shifted as if weighing which room to haunt next. When Tomas slept in the spare room, the portraits conversed in a hush like pages turning. They recited small, embarrassing truths about the living, which anniversaries were forgotten, where the spare key was kept, the nickname a father used at 3 in the morning. At 3 in the morning they became crueler, or perhaps more honest. The eldest portrait leaned its painted head and whispered a name that belonged to Tomas's past, a regret he had folded into a drawer and told himself he had lost. He woke with the taste of metal and a line of dust on his cheek like a memory being marked. The family who maintained the house called the portraits attentive, and they were, but attentiveness can calcify into possession. One evening, a photograph fell from its mat and revealed a small note. "We held it for you." Tomas thought at first it meant comfort. Later he found the portraits had rearranged themselves to point, together, at the locked upstairs door. The house that remembered had preferences and, like any body that remembers the wrong things, it wanted company in its recollection. Tomas left a candle at the foot of the staircase. It blew out at dawn in a slow, strict puff, and the portraits watched, satisfied. The locked nursery. No one used the nursery anymore. Paint peeled like old assurances, and a wind came through the cracked window smelling faintly of lullabies. The orphanage that owned the house kept that room barred with a chain and a note that read "Keep closed," but chains are tidy only as long as memory respects them, and memory in that house had a restless, patient hand. When Olivia volunteered one autumn to help catalog the building, she found the key tucked in the ledger's spine like a secret that wanted to be read. She unlocked the door because curiosity is sometimes an honest thief, and because the quiet inside felt like a hand waiting to be taken. The room was small, with wallpaper patterned in faded animals whose smiles had grown thin. A wooden cradle rocked sometimes, though no breath entered its space, and when Olivia listened closely she could hear the carriage of a tiny, impossible heartbeat under the floor. Toys arranged themselves into polite lines and then rearranged by night into accusations. A soldier facing the window, a doll with its gaze aimed squarely at the door. On the first night the nursery hummed, not cruelly but insistently, a lullaby in a key that made the bones want to unlace themselves. Olivia dreamed of footsteps that learned to walk differently in the dark, lighter, careful, as if rehearsing an exit. The orphanage staff told stories of a child who had never learned to leave. The house had practiced waiting until it could claim the good habit of attention. One dawn Olivia found the cradle empty and a small sock folded on the pillow like a polite demand. She kept it tucked in her pocket until the house began calling her by a name she remembered but had not used in years. She said it once and felt the room answer in agreement, as if the nursery had only been waiting for affirmation. Locks are paper to the insistence of certain rooms. The chain rusted away, and the nursery adjusted its rocking to match the cadence of Olivia's breath. The seventh stair. Guests joked about superstition when they booked the old boarding house. The owner smiled and pointed to the staircase as a kind of living punctuation. Skip the seventh stair at midnight, she'd say, "and the house will forgive you for the rest." Lila did not believe in curses, only in human tricks and the illusion of safety. That first night she trailed her hand along the banister as if it were a timeline of everyone who had walked here. At the stroke of 12 the house exhaled and the seventh stair, the one with the nick in the wood, ached with attention. People said the stair remembered the fall it had witnessed, a guest who left with less than they had carried in, and that the stair liked to practice correction. When Lila's foot found it, the board sighed beneath her like an apology that had been rehearsed too often. She fell through a dream that stitched together faces from wallpaper and remnants of conversation, and when she surfaced the hallway held a smell of old oranges and grief. The guests rearranged their nights after that. They left coasters, coins, and notes between the treads as if offerings to a temperamental god. Lila found in the morning a single photograph slipped into her palm, a picture of the landing with the seventh stair missing and a pair of tiny wet footprints leading toward the attic. She kept the photograph and felt it grow heavier each night, as though weight were a kind of invitation. The building, patient as stone and vindictive as habit, cycles its grievances through flesh. Lila learned to climb the stairs sideways after that, and sometimes, in the hush, she could hear the seventh stair counting, 1, 2, 3, soft as the tapping of rain on a tin roof, until the house was satisfied. The boarding house had lessons to teach and the seventh stair kept attendance. The voice in the walls. When Elias moved into the brooding townhouse at the corner, he thought the voice was the wind at first, a low negotiation threaded through the lath and plaster, like an argument settled with a sigh. He installed new shelves and replastered the dining room in an attempt to tidy the sounds into silence. The voice would not be tidied. It spoke in the hush between his sentences, offering facts about rooms he had not seen and about letters he had not yet written. Sometimes it recited whole, precise names, a librarian in a neighboring town, a child who had swallowed a coin in 1923, and each time Elias heard it he felt his skull grow colder, as if the voice took a little heat to keep itself articulate. It was not malicious in form, it existed with the formal politeness of a butler delivering an uncomfortable truth. The town's old-timers called it the house's memory, but memory can be rancid. One night the voice told Elias to lock the back door, and when he did he found a small, damp handprint on the inside of the frame, pale as bone. He taped a note there that read, "Do not open," and the voice chuckled. It began to tell jokes about doors and then about people who had forgotten promises. The laughter that followed made the wallpaper itch with small, deliberate motions. Elias tried to leave. Every exit he opened folded back like a greedy map, streets rearranged, a wrong turn that looped him home. The walls knew the city better than he did and shaped passage to keep certain people inside. The voice softened when he sat in the dark and listed his regrets aloud, and it answered with a catalogue of other people's regrets. A particular cadence in the voice, like a key sliding in a complicated lock, told him the house preferred company in its recollection. He began to speak back, to barter fragments of memory for silence, and sometimes the walls grew silent for whole afternoons. But at midnight the voice resumed with an appetite, gently requesting the details be. The room with no door. In the oldest wing of the manor there was a room the blueprints refused to acknowledge. It did not appear on maps, and yet air from it cooled the corridor like someone opening a window in another century. Builders swore they had sealed the space and carpenters swore they had never seen it. Still, a faint draft hummed from behind a patch of wallpaper patterned with stubborn roses. Alex discovered it after following the sound of a piano that had been played wrong across the house, an arrangement whose cadence never quite resolved. She peeled back the wallpaper one evening and found, instead of studs, a mouth of plaster that sighed, and then laid a single brown envelope in her hands as if delivering something it had taken a long time to be able to give. Inside was a list of names crossed with red thread and a single key that did not fit any lock she owned. The house, she understood, kept rooms for things people did not wish to speak out loud, and the room with no door was the repository for those quiet, shameful belongings. She placed the key in her pocket and felt its weight like a promise. That night the piano played without hands and the corridor smelled of old paper and iron. Alex dreamed she walked into a place that accepted secrets the way a river accepts tributaries, and when she woke, the wallpaper stitched itself back into place as if nothing had happened. She left the key on the mantel and found it moved overnight to the window ledge where Frost sketched tiny hands. The house was managing its inventory. People who visit such houses sometimes find what they seek, sometimes the house returns what it borrowed. Alex kept returning to the corridor to listen, and one dawn she found the envelope empty and a child's voice counting in a patient, exact tone that belonged to no one living. The room without a door had taught itself to speak. The midnight tea. Mrs. Holloway's sitting room was famous for its hospitality and notorious for the way the teacups rearranged themselves after midnight. Guests left early with biscuits and polite confusion. Those who lingered too long spoke of the tea's warmth settling into their bones like an argument with a friendly ghost. The kettle boiled at precisely 12 and a china tray slid across the linen by its own insistence. Sitters claimed the tea tasted of almost forgotten birthdays and of promises made in the sober light of morning. One evening, a man named Rowan accepted a cup and found, at the bottom, a single hair lashed to the porcelain like a small, coded confession. He could not place whose hair it was, but after drinking he remembered a name he had buried, someone he had promised to meet and abandoned. The house was not cruel. It curated regret with the tenderness of a gardener pruning shoots. Visitors began to bring little offerings, a note folded small, a photograph with a corner turned down, a button sewn into a napkin. The tea took them and returned something else, a sound, a smell, an apology in the shape of a dream. On a night of wind and page light, the room asked directly, in the language of china clicking, for someone to tell a true story. Rowan spoke of the broken promise and the teapot rattled as if in applause. The next morning he left with his pockets heavier and kinder. But kindness from such rooms carries cost. Footsteps coming down the stairs at noon sometimes were the sound of someone who has been listening for a long time. The house kept its receipts. Guests who learned to speak honestly before the kettle boiled found the tea generous, and those who kept their mouths closed found the room gradually rearranged into a place they recognized less and less. Hospitality in haunted houses is a transaction, and Mrs. Holloway's sitting room kept its ledger. The Garden of Echoes. Behind the ivy and the gate that refused to close properly, the garden arranged its voices like a choir. Paths braided into one another like sentences that kept correcting themselves, and bronze statues wept dew in the mornings. People gardened there once, families who left notes in the soil and promises tied to saplings, and the plants remembered. When Lena wandered in at dusk, she discovered the hedges whispered back everything she had ever said alone: apologies, vows, the names of lovers, and the admission of fears she had never voiced. The echoes were not exact. The garden edited and amplified certain lines until they sounded like accusations. A bench kept the imprint of a conversation long ended, and when Lena sat she felt the air collect phrases like moths. She found a ring under the rhododendron, warm as if someone had just set it down. The ring fit a promise she had made and forgotten. Wearing it made the garden grow louder, more insistently private. It was as if the plants required witness and compensated by producing their own. Gardeners called it listening soil, and they pulled stubborn weeds like men easing confession from roots. At night the statues shifted their gazes and the fountain hummed a tune that measured the moon's patience. One evening, Lena heard the garden speak her mother's name, and the ground churned with the memory of a burial gone half remembered. She dug with bare hands and found, instead of bones, a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth, apologies that had never made it to their destination. The garden accepted them and sent up a scent like forgiveness, but it also kept a record. People who come to such gardens find their private words become public ornaments. Lena left at dawn with seeds in her pockets and the knowledge that some soils cannot be trusted to forget. The clockmaker's house. The house on Meridian Street kept time the way a seamstress keeps stitches, precise, patient, and with a small tendency toward obsession. Clocks filled its rooms, cuckoos, mantelpieces, pocket variants on velvet, each one insisting its own version of now. The clockmaker who lived there had disappeared decades ago, and the mechanism of absence wound itself into the house like a spring. At night the clocks did not merely chime, they argued in layered intervals, until the house sounded like a city of tiny, angry bells. Visitors who slept there woke with hours sewn into the corners of their eyes. Lucy took the spare guest room because she liked the comfort of noise and the way regularity felt less like fate and more like discipline. At midnight the clocks synchronized and the hour hand stopped for a single, knowing beat. The room cooled and an old, patient voice read aloud a list of times when someone had chosen to leave. The voice did not belong entirely to the house. It belonged to the person who arranged time with so much care that life leaked around its edges. Lucy found a ledger in the drawer filled with appointments that had been kept and appointments that had been missed, all recorded with the tenderness of accusation. When she tried to leave at dawn, every clock chimed the same hour and the front door opened onto another morning entirely. The house adjusted calendars the way some houses adjust curtains, to keep certain people inside lessons they had not learned. On the third night Lucy discovered a watch sewn into the mattress, its face scratched to show a single minute repeating again and again. She wound it and heard a heartbeat that was not hers. Time in that house was not neutral, it was a meticulous judge. The clocks demanded attendance and the house, full of cogs and small compulsions, kept the verdict. The final tenant. They called the estate the lasting because tenants seldom stayed. Names were scrawled into the ledger in ink that bled like old resolve and then crossed out as if erased by the house's own hand. Jonah, newly solitary and stubborn, signed his name and moved his few boxes in one wet autumn morning. The house greeted him with a gust that smelled like old letters and a staircase that remembered the cadence of certain feet. At first it was affectionate in the way that preys on tenderness. The curtains adjusted to give him privacy, the pantry provided spices for recipes he had forgotten he loved, the attic hummed lullabies that softened edges. Then the house, like any careful host with history, asked to be seen. It demanded stories and Jonah obliged, telling it of departures, of the one door he had never quite closed. The house took those stories and turned them into rooms that kept watch, a closet that breathed with the memory of a goodbye, a mirror that showed not how he looked but how he might have been more honest. Each night the house rearranged itself a little, and each morning Jonah found new evidence of an audience in the shape of small, precise notes. "Welcome back, I remember, you left something." The words were gentle but they multiplied until the house's tenderness curled into ownership. On the seventh night a knock came that had no owner, and when Jonah opened the door the hallway held a single silhouette that matched nobody he had known. The figure did not speak. It stepped inside and sat in the chair by the fire as if arriving late to a theater performance. Jonah asked who it was, and the house answered for them both with a chorus of soft doors closing in the walls. The final tenant, the house seemed to imply, was not the one who moved in last but the one who could be kept forever by stories. Jonah realized then that departures in this house required more than legs, they required permission. He tried to leave, but the road home folded and led him back to the threshold, where the silhouette waited, patient as death. The lasting collected people by their unresolved apologies and kept them tucked, like letters, in drawers that could not be opened. Jonah became a page in the house's ledger, and the house, having found its final tenant, closed its shutters with a satisfied click. The orchard that knows names. The orchard beyond the lane behaves like a keeper of small recollections. Its apples taste like moments peeled open, a single bite unfolding a scene you half remember, so villagers speak of it in low, almost fond tones, and visitors go because they want to touch memory as if it were tangible fruit. Lena walked there one dusk with an ache for a friendship that had thinned into absence. The trees leaned like polite listeners, their leaves whispering, and when she touched a fruit a small voice, so soft she might have imagined it, said the name of the person she missed. She bit and found herself tasting a shared umbrella, a laugh across rain, a sentence left unsaid at a kitchen table. The flavor did not erase the ache but folded it into a tidy, manageable thing she could tuck into a pocket. The orchard seems to trade not in miracles but in inventory, small returns of things people can carry home. Afterward the path felt less knotted, and when Lena planted the seeds she found in her pocket, they were gentler than expected. New branches leaned as if to greet her the following year. Folks who visit learn to speak the thing they forgot before they bite, making the ritual the point. That pronunciation calls memory to the surface where the orchard will polish and hand it back, ready to be set next to your pillow. The trees keep their quiet generosity. Those who leave with an apple and a reshaped heart say their sleep comes easier, like a knot being gently loosened. The lighthouse without a keeper. On a ragged coast where few boats pass, a lighthouse has kept its lamp lit for as long as anyone can remember, though official records show no keeper. Jonah climbed the cliff one fog-heavy evening and found the spiral stairs warm with salt and a small journal on the lamp table, entries written in a careful hand cataloging names and small daily mercies, letters left unsent, a song hummed on a rough morning, an unopened jar of jam. The lamp burned with a lemon oil scent, and in its glass the sea reflected faces beneath the surface, peaceful and attentive as if the water were a congregation keeping watch. Rather than alarm, Jonah felt the oddest comfort, as if the lighthouse were a place that politely gathered people's unattended histories and held them until someone came to retrieve them. He left with a scrap tucked under his pillow later that night. We keep watch, so you can rest. Sometimes when the fog presses close, the lamp sweep feels like a hand smoothing the edge of worry, and fishermen say the light does more than warn, it reassures, a small, steady promise that things abandoned sometimes find a shelf. Walkers home along the cliff speak of the lamp as if it is a friend who remembers birthdays. Its reliable arc makes sleep possible simply because someone or something gentle is awake on the shore. The portrait in the waiting room. In a hospital waiting room there hangs a painted woman whose eyes seem to hold time like a cup holds tea, and night after night weary visitors find their worry eased by her quiet presence as if she were a practiced relative who knows when to listen. Emily started talking to the portrait during long visits, listing tiny, silly things she feared she would lose, names of flowers, a recipe for chicken soup, a fragment of a lullaby, and one evening found a napkin folded beside her seat with a single line in a handwriting she did not know, a phrase she thought she had forgotten. The napkin smelled faintly of lavender, and the act of setting that line down felt like placing a stone on an old path. Her chest unclenched. Others left small offerings, a child's drawing, an unpaid bill, a photograph, and sometimes the portrait's presence rearranged the air into a gentler shape that made minutes less heavy. Over time, the waiting room became less a place of suspended suffering and more a place where small burdens are acknowledged and set aside until someone returns for them. Emily began to sleep between visits in a way that felt practiced, as if the painted woman's steady gaze taught the room that certain worries could be shelved for a while, to be retrieved by daylight with less sharpness. People who pass through come to think of the portrait as a small, tacit helper. No miracles, only the act of holding space so that sleep can arrive untroubled. The postcard from elsewhere. In the back of the post office, a box holds postcards with no return addresses, lost little appeals from distant places, and Lena one rainy afternoon found a card painted with a coastline she hadn't seen and only the line, "I left a window open." She kept the card in her wallet and weeks later found herself passing a small house she'd never noticed, curtains parted as if in invitation, and on its sill the same painted card with a new line, "You found the right house." The house contained nothing dramatic, just rooms arranged with considerate care, a kettle half warmed as if someone expected a brief visit, and beneath a loose tile Lena tucked a short honest note as the card suggested. Later she discovered the same words turned into a neat margin note in a book on the shelf, as if the house read what people left and replied in subtle ways. Visitors began to treat the postcards as a gentle geography of small kindnesses: leave a line, receive a quiet nudge back. It was not magic so much as a neighborly tendency turned ritual, a way of confirming presence with paper and breath. People who come to that house say they sleep a little better afterward, as if being noticed and acknowledged by a patient place makes the world smaller and easier to rest inside. The postcards continue to circulate like quiet letters that teach strangers how to be gently seen. The theater of lost lines. The old playhouse sometimes opens at midnight for a performance that is not spectacle but repair. Its stage receives actors who speak confessions like lines and, by voicing them, set aside the small weights that make people sleep fitful. Jonah slipped inside once and watched a cast perform half-remembered monologues, unmailed letters, apologies mumbled into props, the name of a child left unvisited, each admission landing softly into a trunk backstage as if the theater were collecting what citizens had been carrying. The lights dimmed not to frighten but to focus attention, and the actors' faces softened as they returned forgotten things aloud. Leaving felt like stepping away from a gentle mending table. The world outside was the same, but Jonah felt unburdened, his breath a little steadier. Locals say the theater performs for whoever shows up, no tickets required, and that the point is less catharsis than witness, someone saying the thing so it need not live inside you alone. Nights later, when the marquee glowed for no reason, neighbors would pass and lower their voices, grateful for the privateness of it all. The house keeps its curtain lowered most days, but those who have sat in that audience carry a small calm like a worn program in their pocket, and the habit of allowing a thing to be said aloud makes sleep easier, gentler, and less like a battle. The baker's window. A small bakery keeps a painted sign in its window that reads, "Leave a thought," and what began as a joke grew into a town practice. People slip folded notes beneath it, confessions, wishes, tiny apologies, and the baker reads them while the dough proofs. Instead of tossing them, he takes one card a week and presses it into a loaf, not to consume the words but to make room for them. Those who buy that loaf insist its taste is warmer for reasons they cannot name. One note read, "I am tired of carrying my mother's last laugh," and the baker wrapped a loaf, walked it to her door, and left it like an edible condolence. She ate and later tucked a reply beneath the window, "Thank you for listening." Over time the window became a communal shelf for small weights. People set down their sentences and found them acknowledged, sometimes returned as bread, sometimes as a hand-knitted scarf or a matches and candles pack for a dark evening. The act of offering a thought taught the town to be lighter collectively, and customers say taking the bread home smooths the edge of worry. The bakery never solved grief, but it taught a practice of passing things gently from palm to public, and those who slide a note under the pane sleep with an ease that tastes, in the best way, ordinary and kind. The pond that repeats names. By the park, a small pond repeats names in echoes that soften the speaker's edge, and people come to call aloud things they have not wanted to carry in silence. The water answers with a voice that washes each name into a kinder shape, adding a detail sometimes, a scent, a small remembered laugh, that makes the memory less jagged. Sam would sit and say one name a night, listening as the pond returned it with a small additional tenderness, and the repetition arranged his grief into rhythms that fit his breathing. Peter, who could not speak an entire list at once, visited nightly and found the pond gently offered what he needed, a recalled melody, the way a hat sat on a head, the color of a favored chair. After weeks of this work he left a pebble and felt lighter, as if the water had quietly agreed to keep vigil. Folks in town treat the pond like a soft repository. It does not erase loss but teaches the habit of naming and then receiving a softened mirror. People say saying a name by the pond is like putting a stone in a stream. Watching it settle helps the current continue, and with that continuation sleep arrives softer and steadier. The room with the faint music. The small room on the second floor hums a tune so faint at times that you think imagination supplies it, yet its melody arranges the heart into measured breaths, a lullaby without words that smooths sharp thoughts. Mara rented it to finish a book, and the music, sometimes piano, sometimes a single violin phrase, became her companion, slowing her rush of worry into a steady, manageable rhythm. One restless night she found a tiny music box under the bed with a scrap of paper, "Play when the world is too loud," and winding it filled the room with a melody that fit her breath, coaxing sleep like a slow tide. The dreams that followed felt forgiving. Small awkward regrets turned into scenes where apologies were made and accepted, nothing theatrical but enough to rearrange rest. Guests who leave the room carry a calm as if someone has brushed dust from their shoulders. The music does not demand anything, it simply offers cadence, and cadence is how the body relearns to settle. People in the building speak of the room in hushed, grateful tones, and travelers sometimes choose it precisely because its faint, patient song makes the night feel navigable and sleep arrives like a familiar, careful friend. The lantern at the bend. On the road that skirts the marsh there is a bend where drivers slow and look for a single lantern that appears most nights, pale and steady like a promise. Mara stopped there once, drawn not by danger but by a tired, polite curiosity, and sat on the bent bench because it felt right to sit where a light invited you to rest. The lantern hummed in a way that eased the chest as if it knew how to count worries into smaller pieces, and it spoke in the softest of ways, small details about her life that were not secrets so much as things she had misplaced, the way her father folded a newspaper, the name of a childhood friend she had not heard in years, the recipe she kept meaning to learn. These were not demands but careful returns, the sort of remembering that hands you a coat when the wind has started. When the lantern suggested she leave one small thing behind, she dropped an old coin into the dark and felt suddenly lighter as if a pocket had been emptied of grief. At dawn she came back to retrieve what she thought she had left and found only the lantern cold and a second bench impression as though someone else had been waiting politely. Drivers still slow at that bend and some swear the hum lives in the chest afterward like a gentle promise. Others say the lantern is merely memory made visible. Either way, those who sit beneath it rise with an ease that fits the day, carrying a quiet like a stitched-on patch that makes sleep arrive without fuss. The clock in the walls. In the old boarding house on Ashfield Lane, the walls ticked as though filled with hidden clocks. Tenants complained of sleepless nights, for no matter how many rugs they nailed up or how loud they played their radios, the ticking never stopped. At first it seemed mechanical, an old building settling with the years, but the rhythm was too perfect, too steady, like a pulse instead of gears. One tenant, Mr. Calder, pried open a section of the plaster, certain he would find old wiring or pipes, but instead he found smooth stone beneath, carved with symbols that resembled eyes. From that night on, the ticking grew louder, not only in the walls but inside his own ears, rattling his teeth and thrumming through his skull until he swore his heartbeat matched it. Others heard it too, and soon the entire house seemed to live by that beat, as if a heart was buried somewhere deep inside the foundation. One tenant vanished, then another, until only Calder remained, driven by obsession to tear down wall after wall. He claimed he would find the source, the great clock that powered the house, the hidden heart that throbbed behind the stone. The neighbors grew used to the hammering late at night, the shouting, the desperate scraping. Then it all stopped. The house grew quiet, too quiet, not a single tick left within its bones. And yet when a new family moved in years later, they swore they heard faint tapping, as though someone was trapped within the walls, begging to be let out, keeping time with a heartbeat that was no longer theirs. The quiet station. At the edge of town sits a small station that counts time in patient pauses. Trains come sometimes, but mostly the platform holds space the way a good room holds breath, and people who miss the bustle find a comfort there because the hush is practiced and kind. Thomas waited one evening after the last proper timetable and a pale green carriage pulled in that belonged to no schedule. An elderly woman in a fog-colored coat stepped out and, without introductions, began to tell the histories of the benches and the closed shops, the names of children who had moved away, the small mercies that towns forget until someone says them aloud. She pressed into his hand a folded ticket with no date and only the words, "For when you are ready," and Thomas kept it like a secret charm. Months later, when a weight he could not name settled in his chest, he found the ticket and took the pale train, which did not rush but drifted through a sequence of soft returns, conversations he had postponed, apologies he had never voiced, the small afternoons he had misplaced. The carriage smelled faintly of lamp oil and paper and moved with the deliberate patience of a tide that knows how to give things back. When he stepped off hours later, the town looked the same, yet he carried an internal rearrangement, small, neat things placed back where they mattered. The station keeps its late trains for people who need their pasts returned gently, and those rides stitch the mind into a calmer pattern that makes rest easier afterward. The last stop. On the number 7 bus, late at night, the driver never spoke and the few passengers kept their eyes low. The route was normal enough until midnight, when the bus left the familiar streets and began winding roads no one recognized. Windows fogged and the city gave way to forests and hills where no lights burned. Claire, exhausted after work, noticed the bus had emptied, though she hadn't seen anyone leave. Only the driver remained, a tall figure with hands too pale gripping the wheel. She asked when they would return to town, but he did not answer, only flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror, where she saw rows of passengers suddenly seated behind her. Their faces were gray, features sunken, each staring straight ahead with hollow eyes. The bus slowed before a tunnel, its mouth gaping like the throat of some enormous beast. The passengers stood as one, filing silently into the blackness. The driver looked at her then, and in a voice like rusted chains said, "Last stop." She stumbled out, the cold night air cutting into her lungs, but when she turned to watch the bus leave, it was already gone. In its place was only an empty road, no headlights, no engine, no sound but the whispering of unseen passengers, waiting for the next rider to miss their stop.